Dear friends, dear colleagues, I'm happy to welcome you at the EU Days projects. Today is the 22nd May, we are in Odesa, and we proceed with our program by switching to the topic of security. I'm more than happy to welcome our next speaker, Dr. Andreas Umland, who is a senior research fellow at the Kyiv-based think tank, Institute of Euro-Atlantic Cooperation. Our topic today is Ukrainian and broader European security challenges and the opportunities and the possibilities for Kyiv to tackle them. So, Mr. Andreas, the floor is yours.
We've decided that I'll make the presentation in English, although I could also speak in Russian. I've just come from the beach, actually, where I've learned that at a coffee shop where it was written "Лучше моря, только боря." So which was just a fresh impression here from the beach. But we thought that it might be more useful for you to get this presentation now in English, because it also deals rather not so much with Ukrainian issues and with issues related to the domestic affairs of Ukraine, but rather with the Western policies towards Ukraine and what could change here and what challenges not just Ukraine is facing, but the West is also facing in its policies towards Ukraine. So let me first say that my suspicion is that here, during these discussions in your EU study days, you've talked a lot about the domestic challenges of Ukraine, the implementation of the association agreement, the issue of corruption, public administration reform, economic governance, and obviously this is what everybody's talking about, what is on everybody's mind. Will the new government be a reform-minded government? Will the new government be tackling corruption? What is with Petro Poroshenko, with the Panama Papers? What happens here in Ukraine, in Odesa, with the fight against corruption and the establishment of a new system? And certainly all that is very important, and I think it needs to be discussed, and it's fully understandable that this is on everybody's mind. But if you look sort of in a more historical, broader context, I think one should acknowledge that maybe we are now in a new stage in Ukrainian development, where actually these issues of domestic reform and the creation of a new political, economic, social system in Ukraine may actually become secondary to other issues that have become more prevalent now, namely security issues. So my impression is, and maybe I'm too optimistic here, that the Euromaidan has, and the after effects of the Euromaidan, and partly even some after effects of the war in eastern Ukraine, have taken care of some of the major issues that used to be important for Ukraine before the Euromaidan, namely the sort of the correlation of forces that are pro and against reform. I think this correlation of forces, that's of course an old Marxist term that I'm using here consciously, has, I think, fundamentally changed because of the Euromaidan, which lets me to think that in the mid-term future, Ukraine will actually reform. It will be a zigzag course. It will certainly take a lot of fight, a lot of work from various sides, but I think that the issue of domestic reform will sooner or later be solved. Why do I think so? That's first of all because civil society has gone through a process of empowerment in the Euromaidan, so the old division between state and society has now been partly overcome. It has not happened yet to a degree that one would wish. The party system in Ukraine, for instance, is still underdeveloped or misdeveloped, which needs to change and hopefully will change with the next parliamentary elections. What has changed is that the Ukrainian diaspora has become very active in Ukraine, and if you look at the reform process, for instance, in the Baltic countries, you will notice that diaspora Baltic political figures, experts, civil society activists have played a large role in the Baltic states in their reform. I think something like that is happening here now. Also, Russia as a sort of alternative option, the Eurasian Economic Union is basically out of the play. I think this time is basically over. Before the Euromaidan, there was still this sort of an option for the government to play Russia against the European Union this time, and therefore I'm also optimistic about the midterm future of the reform process here. And finally, and that's of course a very ambivalent question, I think the war with Russia in eastern Ukraine, as I would call it, has also, at least I think, partially solved the issue of the division of the Ukrainian political nation. It has actually led to a unification process in the political nation of Ukraine, which is also something that leads me to be, I mean, the war also had many negative, obviously, effects on the Ukrainian economy and society, but it has also had this, one could argue, positive effect that this old division that has often in the previous times played a crucial role for the oligarchs to sort of distract the Ukrainian society, Ukrainian government, and parliament from undertaking reforms. I think this theme has basically, I would say, or at least the salience of this theme has diminished, and I think that's good. And so now basically Ukrainian society can focus on other things, and all the issues about language and historical interpretation, geopolitical orientation, they've become, I think, now secondary. They're still there, but they're not as important anymore. So that these are basically the reasons why I think that while we will see a lot of problems in the next years, we will see probably lots of scandals, lots of zigzags in one or the other direction, changes in government. I assume that in the next parliamentary elections, the Verkhovna Rada will again change to a significant degree. Some parties, like the Narodny Front, the People's Front of Yatsenyuk, will probably disappear simply from the political scenes. Others will come up. Perhaps Saakashvili's movement will be represented in the next parliament. So there will be a lot of change and a lot of scandals and so on. But I think the reform process will continue. And there are already first signs that maybe the new Groisman government will not be as inactive as some people were afraid of. So the presence of such people as Balcerowicz or Miklos as advisors to this new government lets me at least be hopeful that actually this government will be more reform-minded than some of us at least have thought. That unfortunately doesn't mean that Ukraine does not face grave challenges in the future, and I think these grave challenges do not actually have actually changed in nature in that they have become security issues. The main thing, whereas in earlier times, I think the security issue was always there as well, but it was not as salient, as prevalent as today, and the domestic agenda was the main issue. Today, I think both of these issues, they've sort of changed places. I think the domestic reform agenda has actually become secondary to the primary security issue. And I want to deal here briefly with 4 issues. This is the issue of political risk for foreign direct investment, especially in eastern and southern Ukraine. The second issue, the issue of security, basically, of the occupied territories of the Donetsk Basin. and the necessity probably of an involvement not only of the OSCE but also of the UN, I'm afraid. I think the OSCE will not be able to do the job in eastern Ukraine. For Ukraine to enter NATO and to become a NATO member, and I will speak about that, why I think this is the case later on. And finally, the issue of the emergence and perhaps the informal emergence and maybe also later formal establishment of an alternative security structure that is sometimes called the intermarium между морем. So this will be the four issues I'm going to deal briefly here. So the first one is foreign direct investment in eastern and southern Ukraine. I think the main issue for Ukraine in the next years is going to be how to attract foreign direct investment, especially Western foreign direct investment. And as I said, I assume that the domestic reform process will actually go ahead, and that in a couple of years we will see actually an atmosphere in Ukraine that purely from the domestic agenda will be benevolent towards foreign direct investment. However, I think that especially those regions of Ukraine that some people in Russia regard as Novorossiya, New Russia, will have problems attracting foreign direct investment because especially Western investors, but also other foreign investors, will have sort of second thoughts about whether, for instance, investment in Odesa or in other regions and cities in eastern and southern Ukraine is going to be secure from political risks. And the investment that have gone to the Donbass have partly already been some of them have lost their value, obviously, because the buildings have been destroyed or the investors have been expropriated. To some degree, the latter also is true of Crimea, and I think many foreign investors will have to think twice about, or they will be thinking twice about whether to invest in Ukraine, and especially in those parts of Ukraine which is regarded by some people in Russia as belonging to Russia, or that should belong to Russia. The solution for this issue, I've written about it already, maybe you and not only me, George Soros, for instance, has written one of the first articles about this. The solution for that would be some kind of insurance scheme or foundation or organization that would take care of the political risks for foreign direct investments. That is something that is not so unusual in international practice. For instance, the World Bank has a branch that deals with political risk insurance. The problem, and also national states have political risk insurance schemes. The problem with many of these political risk insurance schemes that so far exist is that the business people or the companies that want to use these risk insurance schemes, they have to basically pay for the insurance. And I think what I imagine will have to happen sooner or later is that the European Union especially will have to take care of this issue, because otherwise especially those territories that are by some regarded as Novorossiya will have problems attracting foreign direct investment. Let's say a city like Mariupol will need to have some sort of support in attracting foreign direct investment. And arguably, of course, these are exactly those regions in Ukraine that need foreign direct investment most, and where also the West should have an interest in providing security for investment, because otherwise these regions will become more depressive, economically depressive, and then such a depressive situation in these regions would then give Russia instruments to apply sort of hybrid war strategies to undermine these regions. So I think the West should have a genuine self-interest, so to say, in supporting foreign direct investment in eastern and southern Ukraine, and there are now signs that apparently, at least in the US, there's some understanding for that. There is a new law currently being discussed in the American Congress and in the American Parliament, which apparently would have an article which would foresee some sort of organization or some sort of scheme that would support foreign direct investment by ensuring against political risks. I think that that is going to be one of the major issues for Ukraine in the future, and Ukraine cannot solve this issue by itself. It needs Western support for that, whether that's through the World Bank, through the European Union, through some other organization. That is actually secondary, but I think that something like that would have to happen. And the organization, of course, that is now involved there is the OSCE, and one would think that this should be also the organization that should take care of that. The problem here being that the OSCE is dealing with a situation in the occupied territories that has become, or always was, arguably, a military situation. And the OSCE is an organization that does a lot of things. For instance, it observes elections, it does all sorts of observation and communication, but it is not an organization that has extensive experience with dealing with territories that are militarized, where there are lots of weapons, and therefore I'm skeptical about the prospects of the OSCE as the only instrument to solve the issue in the Donbass. The problem, to put it in very simple terms, in the Donbass seems to me that even if there is political will in Moscow, in Kiev, above all in Moscow, but also in Kiev, I think there's sometimes the question how much there's actually full political will to solve the situation, and also in the Western capitals, it may not be enough just to express this political will and to adopt policies. The situation, and this is partly a suspicion, partly an observation, in the Donbass seems to be now such that there are so many weapons in Ukraine, in eastern Ukraine, in the occupied territories, and that the different troops and groups that are active there are partly, of course, under Moscow's control, but may get out of Moscow's control if Moscow decides to actually resolve the conflict. That in such a situation one would then actually need an armed mission that goes into the Donbass, that creates a temporary organization, and that this would have to be actually a heavily armed mission, and not just a police mission, a lightly armed mission, as is now being discussed with the OSCE. And the only organization, the only international organization that has extensive experience with such heavily armed missions are the United Nations. The OSCE does not have the experience for that, and maybe I wouldn't mind if the OSCE could do the job, or the EU could do the job, or whatever other organization could do the job. But the experience so far has been that only the UN has been successful in sending such peace missions to territories around the world, and then actually creating a sustainable situation. If another international organization can do that, that's fine, but so far we only have positive, at least partially positive record for the UN. You may have seen I've published an article together with a Kiev colleague, Alexei Melnik, who is a Ukrainian military man who was in an armed UN mission in Yugoslavia and Eastern Slavonia in the 1990s in Croatia, and we put partly his experience from from this mission UN mission in Yugoslavia into this article, arguing that what one would need is really a mission that would be multinational, that would have a powerful mandate, that would have heavy weapons in order to disarm the region. The main issue is going to be, I think, for these occupied territories, will they be disarmed? Will actually all these groups that are there now, the mercenaries, the extremists, the Cossacks, and all the different groups that are there now, and many of which are now heavily armed, will they be disarmed? This is going to be the major issue, and as far as I can see for now, the only organization that could actually deliver this, and which has done it, for instance, in Eastern Slavonia, quite quickly, they disarmed within 1 year Eastern Slavonia, which was also heavily armed, and they then restored Croatian national sovereignty over Eastern Slavonia. Provide the security situation necessary for that. I don't think it's going to be that can be done with either the current people who are in power there, nor with the Ukrainian authorities. I'm afraid that because there are so many arms now in eastern Ukraine, I don't think that simply the Ukrainian army could come in and there would be peace there. I don't think that will happen this way. I think these territories have to be disarmed. So at least so far the experience is such that this can be only delivered by a heavily armed UN peace mission. The third issue I want to deal with briefly here is the unfortunate impossibility of Ukraine entering NATO in the foreseeable future. I think there's a lot of illusion in Ukraine, even in the experts community in Kiev, which I know well, among many politicians in the Verkhovna Rada, that if only Ukraine reforms its army, adapts NATO standards, conducts a referendum on NATO entry, and then submits an application for NATO to first become a so-called membership action plan. That's the preparation program that NATO has for future members, and would first get the membership action plan and then actually enter NATO. I think that's an illusion. I think there are many countries there are a number of countries in NATO that would support that. East European countries and also the North American countries, the US and Canada. But I know Germany, and I have the suspicion the same goes for other West European countries, that the publics there would be strictly against a membership either of Ukraine or of Georgia, also of Moldova, but Moldova doesn't have currently official NATO aspirations for a membership in NATO, as long as these countries are in a confrontation with Russia. The fear, the plain fear in, let's say, in Germany of being drawn into a military conflict with Russia is so large that there would be, I think, no support for membership for these countries in NATO. The odd thing is that Ukraine and Georgia and maybe also Moldova, if it decides that it could enter NATO, but only once they've solved their conflicts with Russia. But once they've solved their conflicts with Russia, they wouldn't need NATO anymore, actually. So that's the major NATO. That's the absurd situation that these countries are now in, and the sad truth, and I'm trying to tell that here to as many people as possible in Ukraine, is that NATO membership is unfortunately out of question. NATO may try to, or I know also the bureaucracy of NATO. I've been to the NATO headquarters, to the political headquarters in Brussels, and to military headquarters in Mons in Belgium. There's a lot of sympathy in NATO for Ukraine and also for Georgia, and also, as I mentioned, there's lots of sympathy in Eastern Europe, in the Baltic countries, in Poland, now also in Turkey for Ukraine. But I think the situation in Western Europe will not change. I think there will be always at least some countries that are against NATO expansion. And as you may know, for NATO enlargement, it needs the consensus of all the 28 or soon probably 29 member states of NATO to so all countries, all member countries of NATO will have to approve of a NATO enlargement, and there will be at least some, Germany, Greece, Italy, France, the Netherlands. We've just seen what happened with the association agreement in the Netherlands. There will always be some countries that will be against NATO. Countries of NATO to create something like NATO Plus, to have a sort of agreements with Ukraine, with Georgia, about some sort of support for these countries from NATO. I see this. I see forces that support such a scheme. I wish that these schemes will be successful, but I'm afraid that even a NATO Plus will not actually happen. That as soon as the publics in the West European countries understand that there are people in NATO that want to extend NATO security guarantees towards Ukraine and towards Georgia, I think these publics will quickly mobilize against a NATO Plus. So I don't even see a NATO Plus happening in the future. I also don't see that the association agreements of Moldova, of Georgia and Ukraine can be interpreted in a way so as to argue that the EU is actually providing security guarantees for Ukraine and Georgia. They could be interpreted in that way. There are articles in these association agreements that could be interpreted as providing for security guarantees, but I don't think that will happen for the same reasons for which NATO enlargement will not happen. I think the plain fear of World War III, of a military conflict, in especially the West European publics, is so prevalent and so dominating that I don't see either NATO or the EU giving any security guarantees in the near future to Ukraine, Georgia, and Moldova. And that brings me to the fourth and final point: is what to do for Ukraine in this situation. And maybe you've read already the article I've written about that. It was published. One version was published in Zerkalotyzhnia in Russian and in Ukrainian, but I've also published that in English in various versions. Now a German version is also coming out. The alternative here for Ukraine, which is already sort of unofficially emerging, but may at some point also become a formal institution or a formal organization, is to create a regional security alliance in the East European Black Sea region. So what I see emerging here is a group of countries from Estonia to, in the north, all the way to Georgia and Azerbaijan in the southern Caucasus, a group of countries, now also including Turkey, that basically all have the same problem with Russia. They are in an information war with Russia, they have trade wars with Russia, they suffer from cyber attacks, or like Georgia, Moldova, and Ukraine, they have territorial conflicts with Russia, or like Ukraine nowadays and Georgia in the past, they have military conflicts with Russia. They are in a sort of Cold War situation with Russia, or even in some regards a hot war situation. Is that there's a lot of bilateral and sometimes trilateral cooperation emerging in this region. The Baltic countries and Ukraine, Poland and Ukraine, Turkey and Ukraine. We have already the Guam group. You may have heard about this. This is an organization that exists already for many years, but didn't have much effects. Guam means Georgia, Ukraine, Azerbaijan, Moldova. You know, there is already this group. The problem of this group is that it basically unites weak countries, or well, Azerbaijan is sort of relatively strong within this group, but it unites weak countries. There's also an organization called the Community of Democracies, created in 2005 after the Orange Revolution in Kiev, which unites East European countries that support democracy in Ukraine and in other regions, in other countries in Eastern Europe and in the Black Sea region. But these structures so far have not provided for some sort of security alliance in Eastern Europe. What we are seeing now is, however, lots of various cooperation schemes emerging between those countries that perceive themselves to be in a confrontation with Russia, and at some point there could be a moment when a group of these countries will decide to create actually an agreement, an organization, a pact, a bloc that would actually unite those countries that have basically the same problem with Russia. And there is a historical idea that sort of models that, which you may have heard about already. It's the intermarium Междуморье. That's an idea of the interwar period that has emerged in Poland and has been propagated by Pilsudski after the end of World War I. The original intermarium idea that emerged then in Poland after World War I was an idea of a confederation or even federation of the East European states between Germany and Russia. And the idea was here that these countries, in order to survive between an aggressive Germany and an aggressive Russia, would have to unite. This scheme was not, as you know, was not implemented back then, but it has been in discussions since then, always. I don't think that today the countries like Georgia, Ukraine, and Moldova, they need the intermarium that the Polish thinkers of the interwar period had in mind. So what these countries do not need, I think, is to create a confederation or a federation, because the question of regional economic integration and social and political integration, this question has been actually solved with the association agreements for these three countries. So these countries are already becoming part of a larger European area, and they will be implementing the association agreements, and basically this issue in terms of the economy, infrastructure, science, culture, and so on. For these issues, the association agreements have actually solved the question of an integration of these countries. What, however, countries like Ukraine, Moldova, and Georgia are lacking are a security structure. And what I could see here emerging in a couple of years, if the current situation continues, if the Moscow leadership remains confrontational, the West will not extend security guarantees to this sort of gray zone between Russia and NATO. Then what I could imagine is that a number of countries in Eastern Europe and in the Black Sea region could decide to formalize their already intensifying cooperation. The model here would not be so much Guam or the community of democracies, but the model that I see here that could be applied to such a security cooperation is the treaty on, I think it's called the Treaty on Strategic Partnership and Mutual Aid between Turkey and Azerbaijan that has been concluded in 2010. So there's a treaty between the NATO member, and that's important, Turkey, and the non-NATO member, Azerbaijan, which is also an Eastern Partnership member country, and is already in this EU structure like Ukraine and Moldova. And if you take the title of the treaty, it sounds like, well, strategic partnership, that's a very universal term, inflationary used. But if you look at the text of the treaty, it does actually provide security assurances. It has military sections, and it does not go as far as the Article 5 of the Washington Treaty. That's the treaty that established NATO and where the obligation of the member countries of NATO to defend each other. Every other NATO member country is formulated. The Article 2, which is the most important article of the treaty between Turkey and Azerbaijan, it does not go as far as Article 5 of the Washington Treaty, but it does foresee cooperation and help, mutual aid, in the case of a military attack on one of these countries. Obviously, it's, you know, Turkey is probably much less in need of Azeri help in case of it gets attacked, but Azerbaijan is, of course, very much in need of such security guarantees. So we have here already a model of a NATO member country giving security guarantees to a non-NATO member country, and that is, I believe, a model that can be extended also to Ukraine and to Moldova, if Moldova wants to. I mean, Moldova is a purely geographically in a somewhat less problematic situation, obviously, than Ukraine and Georgia. But if Moldova wants to have some, I think that would probably also want to be part of such a treaty. So what I could imagine, if the current situation, I mean, that all sounds now like fantasy. I know that, you know, this is, you know, some new security structure. You know, a friend of mine, he has commented this intermarium, or what do you talk about, delphinarium, or, you know, people are laughing about this. I understand, it's a fantasy right now. But if you just imagine that the current situation continues for 1 more year, 2 more years, 3 more years, and by current situation, I mean the aggressiveness of Moscow continues, and the West does not provide security guarantees. Neither NATO nor the EU. I think we will be seeing sooner or later this regional security alliance emerging, because there will be a lot of, I think, request from countries like Ukraine and Georgia to get security guarantees. And my feeling is that there are countries, Poland, Romania, Turkey, that would actually be ready at a certain point to extend their sort of an official promise of help in military matters to these countries. Turkey has already done that with regard to Azerbaijan. But if you look at the whole range of bilateral and partly even trilateral cooperation, as you know, there's now a brigade being formed between Lithuania, Poland, and Ukraine. There is already within NATO, which is very, very interesting, there is a cooperation between Poland, Romania, and Turkey. So they have yearly security consultations, I think, since 2011. And I could imagine that these security consultation, which is currently security consultation within NATO, could at some point also include a country like Ukraine, because simply these countries, Poland, Romania, and Turkey, they have the same issues that Ukraine and Georgia have. And that such a bloc or treaty or organization could imagine, in the moment that one of the big NATO member countries, either Poland, Romania, or Turkey, decides to actually, you know, take the step forward and give some security guarantees, above all to Ukraine, but maybe also to Georgia. I think then I think the other countries will come forward as well. I think it's the main. I mean, if maybe Lithuania would be ready to do that already now. I mean, but you know, if Lithuania gives security guarantees to Ukraine, that may not do the trick. But if one of the big countries actually decides to go forward, either Turkey using, for instance, its model with Azerbaijan, or Poland remembering the intermarium idea of the interwar period, or Romania for some reason, then I think the other countries may join, and then we will have actually a new bloc. And I think it's useful just to talk about it and to tell Russia about this. You know, that this might be a model that is emerging, and obviously such a bloc would be an anti-Russian bloc. It may not have that in the name, and it wouldn't be perhaps officially anti-Russian, but the purpose would basically be to protect these countries from Russia's hybrid war. So maybe I'll finish at that and would now take your questions.